yield to Ranking Member Levin for the purpose of an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We very much welcome this hearing. And Mr. Ambassador, we very warmly welcome you here today. Democrats on this committee have been actively working to shape a new trade policy responsive to the changing dynamics of a global economy. We rejected the passive, hands-off approach that earlier characterized American trade policy and embraced actively shaping expansion of trade in ways that grappled with the impact of trade and broadened its benefits and minimized its downsides. These principles have been reflected in our work on this committee for several decades now. They drove our work to ensure incorporating enforceable core labor standards and environmental standards in trade agreements, working with the Clinton administration to adopt worker standards in the pioneering Cambodia bilateral clothing agreement and in the Jordan FTA, opposing CAFTA because of the Bush administration's rejection of that standard, and when in the majority, developing the May 10, 2007 agreement, incorporating the 5 basic international labor and significant environmental standards into the Peru agreement. Those principles guided our refusal to approve the FTAs negotiated by the Bush administration with Korea, Panama, and Colombia until significant shortcomings were addressed. Working with you, Ambassador Kirk, and others in the administration, together we helped importantly improve those agreements, ending the one-way street of Korea's historically closed auto market, ensuring that U.S. taxpayers could not use Panama as a tax haven, developing an action plan to improve labor conditions and address violence against workers in Colombia. We are beginning to see tangible results from these efforts. Ford has already begun shipping cars to South Korea from the United States of America. And work continues with Colombia to ensure full, meaningful implementation of the action plan related to labor rights. Today's hearing will focus in part on potential new agreements to open new markets for U.S. goods and services, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, Russia's WTO accession, the possibility of a U.S.-EU FTA, and the promise of a WTO services plurilateral. As important as these new opportunities are, they cannot be our sole focus. A defining trade issue continues to be our imbalanced trade relationship with China. Unfortunately, the Bush administration too often adopted a hands-off approach to this imbalance. It failed to actively implement the special provision provided for in China's WTO accession for an annual review of whether China was meeting its obligations. The Bush administration refused in all 4 cases presented to it to use the 421 safeguard against surges in Chinese imports that harm U.S. industries and workers. And Mr. Ambassador, this administration took a different tack and used 421. Our trade with China affects myriad industries in their efforts to compete in this market, in China and globally, and it is fundamentally affecting the structure and composition of our economy. A trade policy that ignores or fails to actively address this reality is incomplete and ultimately will prove ineffective. So I applaud the President's decision to create a new interagency trade enforcement center to enhance the administration's ability to aggressively challenge unfair trade practices in China and elsewhere. I urge the administration to ensure that the ITC is designed and equipped to fundamentally alter the way trade cases are developed and prosecuted, and I think, Mr. Ambassador, you'll be talking about that. I also urge the ITC to focus immediately on China's duties on auto exports, its practices in rare earth restraints, its export credit program, its forced technology transfer, and its lack of transparency and use of intimidation as a trade policy tool. the need to actively shape the contents of trade agreements, and not to assume simply that more is always better, applies to the important TPP talks. We must closely evaluate, number one, the challenges presented by unfair competition from state-owned enterprises, the unique circumstances presented by a communist, non-market economy like Vietnam, and the opportunities and challenges presented by prospective new entrances, especially Japan, whether with its long-standing, rigid, exclusionary structures, it presents real new market access opportunities for U.S. companies and workers and creates a new benefit for our economy, including our manufacturers. And finally, with respect to Russia and the WTO, there is a need to approach key outstanding issues in an active rather than passive way, ranging from IPR enforcement to the rule of law. So I look forward to hearing from you, Ambassador, and the other panelists, and how we can continue to craft a trade policy that will meet the challenges of today and anticipate those of tomorrow.